So Arrow is ending next season, and I thought it'd be fun to kind of talk about which or who I think the villain for Arrow season 8 is going to be. We just barely have found out who the villain for this season is going to be, with it presumably being Dante, but we don't actually know for certain if it is Dante yet because the season's been so weird on who the main villain is. We've had so many different characters. We thought maybe it was Diaz at one point and all stuff like that, but now it's kind of clear it's Dante after the most recent episode. Um, but yeah, the Arrowverse shows have been getting less and less clear on who they're making as the main villains. Supergirl is having the same situation this season where it's kind of unclear who they're going for. Um, it's was it's kind of the same thing with the Flash, but they're less iffy on it. They're a little bit more kind of this is who we're using for now, and especially Flash and Supergirl seem to be setting up villains for next season. So it's interesting to talk about who might be the villain of Arrow next season. Now, considering it's Arrow's last season, and the fact that this will presumably be a big deal concerning Crisis on Infinite Earths, I think it should be acknowledged that it's very likely Arrow won't have a main villain next season. It's very likely the 10 episodes next season will just be about wrapping the show up, kind of wrapping up any storylines that have been left over and setting up Crisis on Infinite Earths. Because I find it weird that if Oliver does die in Crisis on Infinite Earths, that because I think episode 9, no matter what, is going to be the crossover, with episode 10 being the final episode of Arrow. So it'd be weird if Oliver died in Crisis, yet the team still have a villain to defeat in the final episode. I think it should definitely be considered there won't be a villain next season. If there is a main villain next season, I think it's going to be someone who they will wrap up before the crossover. So maybe it could be Joe Wilson, or Kane Wolfman, or whatever he's calling himself these days, as Jericho or Deathstroke's son. It makes sense. Deathstroke is one of the most personal villains to Arrow, so for Slade's son to come back and want revenge or whatever on Oliver, I think it could make sense. It would be cool, but personally, I don't think I would be that interested in that storyline. I love Deathstroke, but saying that, I think a lot of the reason why I love Deathstroke in this universe is the betrayal from Manu Bennett. The guy who plays Joel Wilson, he's fine. But we haven't seen him enough to really get a good look at him. And what I've seen so far doesn't make me too hyped to see him on screen. So I don't know. I think he would definitely suit more being a character like he is now in the Ghost Initiative, kind of this villain who shows up every once in a while to wreak some havoc, but he's not big enough to kind of hold his own season. It is possible that, speaking of Joe Wilson, that we will get a villain from the past coming back. Maybe Slade is evil again. Maybe Malcolm's somehow back. With Crisis on Infinite Earths, it's possible for getting villains from different Earths, and they're just people we've seen before. Saying this, I think it's possible. I think it's not possible. I think it's likely we'll see Malcolm in the final season in some form or another. I don't think he'll be the main villain though. Slade as well. While I think it's very likely we'll see him in the final season, I think the only reason he hasn't been in the back half of this season is because Manu's been busy. That's why we're getting Joe Wilson stuff instead of Slade Wilson stuff. I don't think it's because they can't use him. I think they definitely are allowed to use him again. So I think it is likely we'll see him again next season, because I think since it's the final season, they'll make time for him to show up. The thing is that I would actually personally not like Slade to be villain. I would love to see him again, but I think having him as a villain would take away from his character development. The story of Slade in the show is that he's never been a villain. It was just the Mirakuru that made him a villain, but besides the Mirakuru stuff, he's always been a friend to Oliver, a brother to Oliver. So for them to just make him a villain out of nowhere without any Mirakuru stuff, I think would take away from the character development and the relationship that him and Oliver have. So I wouldn't be too enthusiastic about that. It's possible we'll have an entirely new villain, someone that's unrelated to anyone we've seen before. Some people that it could be is maybe Onomatopoeia. He's a character that people have wanted to see in Arrow since season 1. And while I don't love that villain, in general, he barely showed up in Green Arrow comics in the first place. He was just kind of there. I think, yeah, it'd be cool to see a character like that in live action. The only thing is that from what I know, Kevin Smith and the Arrow crew, like the Arrow writers and that, don't exactly get along, or at least I think they didn't get along with Mark Guggenheim was in charge. It's possible it's different now, so I think that's why they have refrained from using any Kevin Smith related stuff, is because they don't exactly talk to each other. So I think that's also why Kevin Smith hasn't directed an episode of Arrow yet, despite the fact that he's written arguably the best run of Green Arrow comics ever, I think. But it's possible we'll see a new character like that. It's also possible we'll see the return of Count Vertigo, a character we haven't seen since season 3, I want to say, the new version of Count Vertigo. He's such a big Green Arrow villain, but he was always very underutilized, so to have him be the final villain would be pretty cool, especially since he was one of Green Arrow's first villains. Now, all this said, there is somebody that hasn't been a villain yet, but we've seen him on the show, and I think this would be my absolute... If I had to pick one person from anywhere to be the villain for the final season, this is who I pick. And that is Colin Donnell as Tommy Merlin as the Dark Archer. So, in the comics, there are 2 Dark Archers. One of them is just called Merlin, that's Malcolm Merlin. He never actually is called Malcolm in the comics, but it's Merlin. And then Merlin's son, who is Tommy Merlin, does become the Dark Archer much, much, much later on and starts fighting Oliver. So, it would be cool to take that from the comics. But on top of that, I feel like they've been setting up Tommy. I think in season 1 they were setting it up as Tommy possibly becoming a villain at some point. I think they just didn't really account for the fact that Colin might not be able to come back, because we haven't seen Colin in any big way since the end of season 1. We had that cameo appearance in season 2 episode 9. We had him cameo in the flashbacks in season 3, twice actually in season 3, but they weren't very big at all. We didn't see him in season 4. We didn't see him in season 5. I guess you can count the 100, but it was reused footage. We saw him twice in season 6. We saw him once when he took off the Prometheus mask from Earth X, but it was very brief. And then we saw him in episode 21-ish, which was just human target pretending to be Tommy Merlin as the Green Arrow. That's the only times we've kind of seen Tommy since he left the show, and none of them have been big appearances. They've all been like brief 1-2 minute appearances in whatever episode he was in. So I think it's really hard to get Colin back because he's so busy on other TV shows. But I think if they were going to try and get a villain, this could be it, because it's so easy to explain. And we know that Malcolm at one point had his own private Lazarus pit. That's how he came back after Oliver killed him. It would be so easy to explain that Malcolm at one point put Tommy's body into that Lazarus pit shortly after Tommy died, and Malcolm essentially had Tommy kept hidden ever since. Maybe he was training, becoming sane again. But you don't even have to do that. If you don't want to do that, it's easily explainable to have him be from a different Earth. We've seen so many characters on Arrow that have been from different Earths. It's so easy to explain why it could be Tommy Merlin. But also, it would just be a cool parallel because they were best friends. On top of that, it would parallel back to the very first flashbacks we saw in season 1. Well, not the very first ones, but we saw them in season 1, where Robert Queen and Malcolm Merlin were they didn't like each other too much. They were butting heads a lot. So it would be cool to kind of get that parallel with now their sons, Oliver and Tommy, are also enemies. I would hate it because, well, I would love it, but it would be a little annoying because Oliver and Tommy were such good friends and it was so nice seeing them. But at the same time, if we had to get any villain for the final season, this would be who I would like. But yeah, that is who I think. They're just everyone I was thrown out there as who could be the villain for the final season. Who do you think is the most likely, and who would you like? And yeah, I can't wait for the final season, but I'm also going to cry because it's going to be very emotional. But have a great day.